The risk of losing a crop is always a big part of being a vegetable grower. With all the possibilities of pests and diseases and deficiencies, as well as the adverse weather conditions, sometimes it seems that the whole world is out to get our crops. A big part of being a vegetable grower is knowing what to anticipate and knowing how to prevent problems from arising, and then also knowing how to deal with the situation when it does appear. And sometimes a problem arises and we're not really sure how to deal with it. And just when it looks like we're about to lose most of the crop, a situation seems to resolve itself and we're not always certain why. I had this happen with a crop of spinach in my polytunnel garden this spring. True annual spinach has a reputation of being a difficult crop to grow, and one of the reasons why a lot of people grow a variety of chard called perpetual spinach instead. But I like growing annual spinach, and the spring batch of this crop in my polytunnel garden is usually one of my favorite crops. It grows really well in the cool part of the season under the protection of the plastic, producing a high yield of valuable, tasty leaves. There is the inevitable bolting, or when the plant shifts its focus away from producing big tender leaves and into producing the flower stalk so that it can produce seeds. But I've found that by the time this happens, I'm usually eager to replace the spinach plants with tomato plants or some other warm season crop. As an early season crop, spinach fits well into this context, and I've also had reasonably good success with it in some of the outside gardens. Apart from bolting and occasional issues with slugs, I've had very few problems with this crop over the past few years until this season. I was only beginning to harvest from my usual big bed of direct sown spinach plants when I noticed that pale patches were suddenly forming on the top of some of the leaves. At first I thought this was indicating some kind of mineral deficiency, but on closer examination I realized that there was a mold or a mildew on the underside of the leaves. I don't remember having this type of problem before, or at least not at this scale, and it seemed to have spread really quickly to infect a lot of the spinach leaves across the full bed. I did a bit of research and I was disappointed to learn that this was likely a downy mildew, which can apparently be a really serious disease for spinach crops. This disease is spread by airborne spores that are produced from an infected plant, which in my case was probably the remains of an overwintering crop of spinach that was occupying another part of the polytunnel at about the same time. Apparently, if the mildew experiences a certain range of temperature and humidity for the right number of days, it can produce a lot of spores that can travel quite a long distance in the wind. And when the spores land on other spinach leaves, they need just enough humidity or moisture to cause a new infection, and the inside of this polytunnel is almost always humid, especially in the spring. Reading about all of this and looking at how extensive the infection was, I figured I was probably going to lose the crop. At that point, I had a few conflicting instincts. The first one was to pull out the whole crop right away and to put in another quick-growing crop, or to transplant in the tomato plants a lot earlier than anticipated. This was the more ruthless and cautious option, as it would have reduced the risk of this downy mildew spreading, but I wasn't ready to give up on this crop just yet. The other approach would be to try out all the possible remedies and solutions, to try to delay or restrict the spread of this mildew, to try to harvest as much out of the crop as I could. Watering the leaves of the spinach with a solution of baking soda mixed in with water seemed to be a very common recommendation to delay the spread, but I decided against doing this. I did water the whole bed with a liquid feed of a seaweed solution, which I've gotten into the habit of using when plants seem to be having trouble. I see it as the equivalent of taking a multivitamin to supply a wide range of nutrients, some of which might be in short supply. Apart from that, I decided to take the risk and stand back and observe, to see what would happen and to take the opportunity to learn, and to harvest what I could from the crop. I threw out a lot of spinach as I methodically harvested the leaves, and it did take me a lot longer to harvest for a period of time. But I was willing to put in the effort at this scale, which would not have been viable at a larger commercial or market garden scale. Over the next few weeks, I was pleasantly surprised to find that the mildew didn't seem to spread at all, apart from the initial infection, and I was intrigued about the reasons why it didn't spread. There was still mildew on some of the leaves, and there was the typical damp conditions within the humid space of the polytunnel. Perhaps the specific conditions of humidity and temperature that was needed for the mildew to produce a new batch of spores didn't occur again, and this is a possibility, but I really don't know. I hadn't reduced the density of the plants very much, so there was still a fair amount of competition in this garden bed, and not nearly enough air movement that is recommended to keep the leaves dry. Perhaps the liquid feed of seaweed did the job by supplying some nutrients or trace elements that were missing, or boosting the health of the plant in some other way. This would be an easy thing to claim, as the seaweed solution likely had some positive impact, but correlation is not causation, and I felt I needed to avoid the temptation of seeing this as a solution or a cure. The fertility and mineral balance of the soil has become quite good over the past few years, which I've confirmed in soil tests, and by the abundant and healthy growth of most crops. But over the years, I've come to suspect that mineral deficiencies often appear in this calcareous soil that I have when the soil becomes too dry. It seems that the high levels of calcium in this soil will cause the availability of other minerals to be restricted as the soil dries out. I realized that I probably hadn't adjusted the amount of watering that I was doing to account for the warmer conditions and the faster growth of this crop. It is possible that the soil was dry enough for a few days to cause stress to the spinach plants when they couldn't get the water or nutrients that they needed from the soil, and this may have been a contributing factor to the initial infection. There seems to be this general idea out there that pests and diseases are just waiting to overwhelm our crops, and it's our job to defend against this onslaught. This way of looking at things would cause us to take a more defensive approach to avoid the specific conditions that would allow the mildew to spread, and growing varieties of spinach that have been bred to be more resistant to downy mildew. But the variety of spinach that I grew is apparently resistant to 4 races of downy mildew, so either this is a different variation of mildew or something else is also happening. Another way of looking at all this is that many problematic issues can arise when plants don't get everything that they need in order to be truly healthy, including appropriate amounts of sunlight, space, warmth, water, and the right mix of minerals from the soil. In the case of my crop of spinach, I'm leaning towards the possibility that a lack of sufficient watering on my part led to the drying out of the soil, which caused a restriction in the availability of essential nutrients at a key time, which led to moderate stress in the plants, which allowed the mildew to take hold. Once the soil moisture levels rose again, nutrient availability possibly balanced out again, and the spinach plants were able to get everything they needed from the soil, and they became less susceptible to the infection from the mildew spores. Of course, it is possible that the specific combination of temperature and humidity that is needed for another batch of spores to develop just didn't happen again. Or it could be that by correcting the deficiencies experienced by these plants, they were able to boost their inbuilt resistance. I don't know which one it was or if there was some other factor, but I do know that I need to avoid the temptation of jumping to conclusions on the basis of one observation, but it would be interesting to see if this mildew issue appears again. I ended up with quite a good crop of spinach out of all of this, even if it took me a lot longer to separate the good leaves from the bad. I threw out a lot of leaves which had spots of mildew on them, but I still harvested about 26 kilograms or about 57 pounds of spinach from this bed, 5 kilograms of which I had harvested after removing about half the spinach plants to make way for the tomato plants. As this bed of spinach was 4 square meters or about 43 square feet, this translates to about 6.5 kilograms per meter squared, or about 1.3 pounds per square foot, which is a pretty good yield for a high-value spring salad crop like this, and on par with yields that I've had harvested from previous seasons. The yield could have been even higher if I had paid more attention and taken more care, or if the mildew hadn't spread in the first place. I've finally installed a sprinkler system in this polytunnel, which will help to ensure that the soil moisture levels don't drop low enough to cause nutrient availability to suffer in the future. But I wonder if this overhead watering system could increase the likelihood of creating the conditions that would enable the mildew spores to develop and spread, and perhaps a drip line watering system would have been better. Hopefully this issue won't appear again, but I'll be keeping an eye out for signs that I'm not doing what I should be doing. And I'm really glad that I didn't remove the crop when the problem first appeared. The approach of waiting and seeing what happened definitely paid off this time. I'm really delighted how this polytunnel garden has developed this season. It's been my best year so far. And I'm still amazed at how much food you can grow in a polytunnel in the spring, given the right conditions. I'm planning to make another video about all of that in the near future, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in the work that I'm doing. If you'd like to support this Red Gardens project and my work in creating these videos even more, Liking and sharing and subscribing definitely helps, and I've identified a few other options in the description below. If you're interested and able, I would really appreciate looking at those. But most importantly, thanks for watching my videos, and thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one.